And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this late Saturday afternoon here with me in New York. We might get snow later. We might get a lot, or maybe it won't be so bad. It depends on the temperature, but we're toughing it out. And there are actually a lot of important milestones, anniversaries, birthdays today. I'm just going to briefly mention that, 49 years ago today, what I believe to be Martin Scorsese's masterpiece, and features one of the greatest performances ever given by an actor or actress in a movie, Taxi Driver, opened in the United States on February 8th, 1976. It was a low-budget film. It cost less than $1.5 million to make. I find that hard to believe, but that's what it supposedly says on, know with these things. But supposedly it cost less than $1.5 million to make. It grossed close to $30 million total around the world. And it won Martin Scorsese the best film, the Palme d'Or, at the Cannes Film Festival in 1976. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to get Martin Scorsese even the courtesy of an Oscar nomination at the following year's Oscars. People are always talking. They've been talking for decades about how ridiculous the Oscars can be. Scorsese not getting a Best Director nomination for Taxi Driver, let alone winning. Should have won it. Didn't get a nomination. Taxi Driver should have won Best Picture. Spoiler alert, it's better than Rocky. And I am a huge fan of Rocky. Spoiler alert, Robert De Niro for Taxi Driver should have won Best Actor over Peter Finch. But you know something? If they had gone with Sylvester Stallone, that would have been okay too. Because those two guys gave all-time home run performances. And Peter Finch, he's great in the movie Network, but he shouldn't have gotten the Oscar. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. But Taxi Driver, released 49 years ago today, that is the first kind of pivotal milestone. And I've spoken of the movie frequently. There's no reason for me to cover the same territory. Then, also today, there is a milestone, birthday of somebody who's passed. Jack Lemmon, two-time Oscar winner, was born 100 years ago today. So I guess you could say he was born a couple of weeks, literally, after Paul Newman. That was not something that I had ever put together before. And Jack Lemmon was a fantastic actor. He was great with comedy, light comedies, and then more serious comedies, and light dramas and more serious dramas. Lemmon was as versatile as any actor, really, who ever worked in Hollywood. He was just great at everything he did. And it's ironic that he's almost most famous for being on the receiving end, at least among younger people, of Alec Baldwin's epic rant, "Put that coffee down." It's Lemmon that he's talking to. "Your name's Levine. You call yourself a salesman, you son of a bitch?" Absolute gold. So yes, Jack Lemmon, who unfortunately wasn't very old when he passed. He died of cancer when he was 76. He had just completed work on a film that I think is actually pretty good, The Legend of Bagger Vance, a sort of golf movie where they blend real-life figures such as golfers Bobby Jones and Walter Hagen with the fictional character played by Matt Damon. Ranulph Junna, I think was his name. It was a weird name. And Will Smith plays the title character, Bagger Vance. And that's the last film that Jack Lemmon made before he passed at 76. But what I really wanted to talk about today are the immortal words of Al Pacino in Scarface. Talk? What we got to talk about? Today is the 34th anniversary of a comedy which is at times conventional and other times feels like a Salvador Dali, Luis Buñuel collaboration. I'm sorry for the egghead references, but that just means absurdist, surrealist imagery where you say, well, this can't be real. Kind of like Groundhog Day. Well, a guy, that couldn't happen. Yeah, no shit. It's a movie. We kind of go with it. But on this day, 1991, Steve Martin, working from his own script and a very strong filmmaker in Mick Jackson, L.A. Story opened in theaters. Now, I guess you could say my personal connection to this film, such as it was, is that this is a movie that my father had found out about. And I don't remember how. This is, after all, I was in 11th grade. This is quite some time ago. But my dad had apparently read maybe in New York Magazine about this movie, and there was a little bit of, in the pre-internet era, a little bit of buzz, and Dad had been talking about it for a couple of weeks, and he was looking forward to seeing it the Saturday night of its opening weekend, with his lady friend. And he ended up loving that movie. My perception of him was not that he was like this huge Steve Martin fan. I don't know that he was a fan of Steve Martin's stand-up, which at the time was pioneering. He was doing shit on stage that, nobody had really, Robin Williams broke a lot of rules. Steve Martin broke a lot of rules. And certainly younger audiences who know the name and, oh, that's the old guy with Selena on, There's Only Murders in This Building. Steve Martin was a crazy, and they used to say the wild and crazy guy, but he was pulling shit on stage, like Gallagher level stuff, where people were saying, we got to throw a net on this guy. He was almost at the Andy Kaufman level, where you're like, is this part of the act? What the fuck is this guy doing up here? But Steve Martin made a lot of very conventional comedies in the decades of the 80s and 90s. But L.A. Story was something, it was a script that he worked on for 7 years. He started tinkering with it right around the time he made a movie with Lily Tomlin called All of Me, which was a film that marked Steve Martin as not just a funny guy who could act, but as a sort of singular talent and somebody that maybe had a little bit more dramatic range than people would have expected. So L.A. Story got great reviews. And if you go right now on Rotten Tomatoes, it is at 91%. And I've said this kind of thing before, but a big studio Hollywood comedy does not normally get a score that high. It's very rare. And it shows you the level of quality, even with the surrealist, absurdist spectacle and the things that take place in the movie where you say, well, this can't happen and that can't happen. But you just go with the flow. And Martin was never just content to hit marks and laugh lines and give the audiences a few chuckles and get out of there. He always had a lot to say about society. In the case of this film, he had a lot to say about life in Los Angeles circa 1990-91, even if it is into surrealist territory. Like, for example, the movie, very early in the film, Steve Martin is in this kind of park. It looks like it should be a dog park, but it's kind of a human park, and that makes us giggle. And then there's an early scene where they're driving on the LA freeway. This is 3 years or so before Speed, which was, stay on or get off, stay on or get off. Do not attempt to grow a brain. And there was something about, oh my God, it's open season on the LA freeway. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is everybody is packing and they're all pulling out guns and shooting at each other. That scene is supposed to let us know this is not real. This movie is a fantasy. It is a comic fantasy. It is a surrealist, absurdist, Dali, Buñuel kind of story where anything goes and anything might happen. So it was a very out there concept. And it's probably why it took Steve so long to get the screenplay to a level where he felt comfortable giving it to a filmmaker he liked, in the case of Mick Jackson, and just going ahead and making a movie. Now, Steve Martin had a run, meaning, where he was just knocking out one either artistically significant or huge hit movie. He was just knocking out one after another. He was so busy, I don't know when he even found time to sit still. Because if you go back to 1986, he has Three Amigos with his buddies, Martin Short, speaking of Only Murders in This Building, one of his co-stars, and Chevy Chase. And then in 1987, he has Roxanne, a great movie, certainly in his top 5. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, phenomenal. Then he does Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Sir Michael Caine, also phenomenal. He does Parenthood, fantastic. What a great movie Parenthood was. He does My Blue Heaven with Rick Moranis, another one of his old pals. Also a very well-remembered movie. Arugula, it's a vegetable. And for those who don't know, My Blue Heaven is adapted from the same book. It's adapted from Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi. Do you know who that is? You know what Wise Guy is? Goodfellas. The character that Steve Martin plays in My Blue Heaven, it's Henry Hill. He's called Vincent Antonelli, but it's the same guy. It's Henry Hill. after the events of Goodfellas, when he's trying to fit into suburbia, and he's a mobster, and there's probably going to be people coming after him. That movie is actually really good. I didn't like it the first time I saw it, but it grew on me. And in 1991, I may have left a movie or two out. He was so busy. But 1991, he had legitimately one of the great individual years that any actor or actress has ever had. It's up there with Jim Carrey in 1994, where he had Ace Ventura in January, huge hit, came out of nowhere. The Mask in the summer, huge hit. Dumb and Dumber in December, huge hit. In 1991, Steve Martin had LA Story, an artistic triumph. Critics loved it. Audiences came to see it. It turned a big profit. He had Father of the Bride at the end of the year. Not great. Also working with Martin Short again. The ace in the hole with Father of the Bride is Diane Keaton. Diane Keaton as the wife. It is one of those that is supposed to be a thankless role, but because it's Diane Keaton, she's the best thing about the movie. And Martin allows Diane a great moment, one of the best moments of Diane Keaton's career because of how Steve plays this. They're about to give away their daughter. And Diane Keaton looks absolutely radiant. You know, when I first saw that movie, I'm 17. She looks really old to me. Yeah, Diane's about 43 or 44 when that's shot. So they're kind of touching up each other's look. And Steve Martin, believably, gazes upon Diane Keaton, her character is Nina, as if it's his wife. It doesn't feel like two actors just reading lines. He gazes upon her with such kind of lust, if we're being, completely honest here, in his eyes. And he says, "You shouldn't look this good. It's not fair to the bride." And it's a perfect line reading by Steve, and Diane's reaction is right on the numbers. That's a great moment. So he had Father of the Bride at the end of the year, LA Story towards the beginning, and then in the fall, he's part of the ensemble of Lawrence Kasdan's Grand Canyon, which technically is Kevin Kline's film, but Steve steals the movie. He plays a movie, is a producer, like a Joel Silver kind of guy, and he just walks away with the film, and it's a strictly dramatic role. He has a couple of laughs in an early scene, but the character is not a figure of fun. It is not a comedic performance. And Lawrence Kasdan, kind of a sense of humor himself, he had Steve grow a beard, presumably so that his character would be taken more seriously because he has a beard. It's kind of like the Robin Williams, if he's clean shaven or if he has a beard. If he's clean shaven, it's funny. If he has a beard, it's serious. It doesn't always follow. But Martin was just crushing it in that 5-year stretch from 86 through 91. And artistically, LA Story is one of his triumphs. There's no way around it. And he gets so much value from his co-stars. Marilu Henner, she of the godlike memory, she's hilarious. And his wife at the time, Martin, Victoria Tennant, is very funny. And Steve's character, it's strange how Hollywood repeats certain things. Hollywood went through a phase where there were main characters in films that were weathermen. Steve Martin is a TV weatherman. 2 years later, Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, speaking of, is what? He's a weatherman. He's a wacky weatherman. Phil Connors, ironically, is not really a wacky weatherman. He's just sort of an asshole. But Steve Martin in LA Story, great name, Harris K. Telemacher. He's a wacky weatherman. He makes a fool of himself on TV. People tune in. He's a bit of a celebrity. And Steve Martin has a moment. I'm going to repeat this. They wouldn't do it now. There's no way that this particular line would stay in a film. And again, I always say, I'm not criticizing. I'm merely observing. This is not a criticism. But Steve Martin is hanging out. This is when he and Marilu Henner, they're still together. And there's a couple of other people in the house. And Steve Martin just randomly says, "I could never be a woman." Okay. Now, when you start a philosophical kind of discussion, just throwing out there, "I could never be a woman," think of the possibilities, the level of conversation that could be had after that opening statement of "I could never be a woman." You know how he explains it? Why he could never be a woman? He flatly just throws out there, "I would just stay home and play with my breasts all day." Like that was the only answer he could possibly come up with. Now that got a big laugh in theaters from what I could gather from my dad. He said that was one of the liveliest crowds that he ever saw a movie with. And it became the sort of film that he could always, revisit. I didn't see it until it landed on VHS. And I got to tell you, the first time through, it didn't work that well for me. I was expecting it to be more conventional. Now with the internet and with all of the information that we can glean, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's YouTube, whether it's just your social media feed in general with trailers, I thought that this was a conventional comedy. And when it went into all of these surrealist directions, it went over my head. When I revisited the film a couple of years later, I said, this might be the best movie that Steve ever made as star. Like, I was sold on it. And ironically, speaking of the same magical year for Steve Martin, the first time I saw Lawrence Kasdan's Grand Canyon, I didn't like it. It wasn't the movie that I was expecting, and it didn't do what I wanted it to do. I was expecting a ABC story, and Grand Canyon is not. There is actually no central conflict in Grand Canyon. There's really not a central conflict in LA Story either. It's not that it meanders along, but it does not have a conventional, like Phil Connors in Groundhog Day. He gets stuck, spoiler alert, reliving probably 50 years worth of Groundhog Days. Nobody knows. It could be as little as 10. It could be as many as 1,000. We don't really know. But the story is that this guy who doesn't want to be in Punxsutawney gets stuck reliving the same dull day ad infinitum. If LA Story followed a conventional pattern, it would be something as simple as Harris K. Telemacher is trying to advance his career and is some kind of a contest. It could be a Bruce Almighty sort of thing or Evan Almighty, but it doesn't go in any of those directions. It takes us down a very absurdist path where life lessons are not necessarily given to him by other characters. They're given to him by a billboard, an electronic billboard somewhere along the LA freeway. Who knew that the answers to life, to love, to happiness, you just got to stand in front of a billboard off the LA freeway. Poof, your problems are gone. Another thing that I really like about this movie is the handling of Sarah Jessica Parker's character. By the way, she is fantastic. And I know she's an actress, there are a lot of people don't like her, the performance style, Sex and the City, and Just Like That, whatever. But I think she's dynamite in this film. She plays a character who is a Valley girl. Like, she's almost literally a Valley girl. Her name is Sandy, but she spells it in a funny way, in a weird way. And it would be an easy character to become unlikable, but she has such energy. And the way that Steve Martin explains his pairing with her, he's come out of a bad relationship. The situation with Marilu, spoiler alert, it doesn't really go well. And she's not nice to him anyway. He could do better. No offense. And so he meets this really attractive young girl with a lot of spirit, and she's into him. And Steve Martin, in a voiceover, as the main character, Harris K. Telemacher, he's pretty much explaining himself. Why did I go for Sandy? Because I'm a big, dumb male. The implication was, I'm not really having a good time, even though I'm making money. I'm not having a good time in life. I'm coming out of a really lousy breakup with a woman I probably shouldn't have been with in the first place. And this really hot girl is into me. Sometimes it's good enough. And it's not the sort of moment that was going to resonate with me when I didn't have a social life. But as an older person, as somebody who, spoiler alert of my own life, somebody who has loved and lost and been through some pretty rough times up here, there is something to be said for a person expressing real genuine interest in you, even if it's just going to be a couple of weeks of sex, as in the case of Steve in this film. But I really appreciate that Sarah Jessica Parker gives a fully fleshed out performance. She's not just picking up a paycheck. She's really good. And, she and Steve, they look nice together. The thing with Steve is that he always looked older than he was. His hair was almost entirely gray by 1986. He was 40 going on 41. In this movie, he's 45 when it's shot. I thought the guy was 60. I'm sorry, Steve, if you ever tune into this podcast, humble apologies. I'm an enormous fan. But he just is somebody who always looked older. You could see some of his crazy stand-ups on YouTube from the 70s, it looked like his hair was going gray when he was in his early to mid 30s. It happens with some people. That part of it is probably genetic. I don't think it was, oh, he was doing so many drugs, because there are plenty of people that do nothing but drink and do drugs and age magnificently. We can find a lot of them in Hollywood, not naming any names because I don't know any names for sure. But the thing with LA Story is it has a kind of joyfulness of spirit. It is a very upbeat film, even if some weird stuff happens, and even if the main character does get laid low several times where he really doesn't know where he's going. It is kind of an existential crisis sort of a movie. But when I mentioned about Steve Martin in real life having certain preoccupations, because he has written a number of books, some of which are just, for laughs and humorous, not necessarily assemblages of jokes, but funny stories and things that happen to him. But he is a student of people, as many of the great comics, whether it's George Carlin or Robert Klein. His observations are very, very solid. Steve Martin, without realizing it, or maybe he knew this was inevitable, he has a moment of pure genius in this film where he appears to predict the very near future with stunning accuracy, where you can't believe what you're seeing. You're telling me that he did this scene. He shot this scene sometime in the summer of 1990. Yeah. Wow. Well, the wow moment of this film, the scene that in 2025, people looking back who only know Steve Martin, and not that there's anything wrong with a young person only knowing him because of the TV show he does with Selena. This guy is a genius. That is the only takeaway somebody under 30 will have watching this scene. So LA Story takes place in a kind of almost a cockeyed, hyper unrealistic Los Angeles. Now, he takes real things and then twists them. Fine dining. We know that you might order, let's say, lobster tail with potato and a green. And it's not exactly going to be a ton of food, but it's going to be very artistically presented. Well, there's a scene in a fancy restaurant that takes that to its extreme, where Steve has ordered asparagus, baked potato, and a lobster tail. And they bring the plate to him, and it's about maybe a half an ounce worth of food. It's a miniaturized lobster. It's half of an asparagus stalk, and it's about a tiny little piece of a potato, and that's supposed to be dinner. It's probably, a couple of $100. I'm finished and I don't remember eating. Well, later in that scene, you have a group of friends, including Marilu Henner character, and I think Kevin Pollak is seated near Steve in this particular scene. They go around the table, and each person has a very specific coffee order. Now, that is not something that was done. That was not done in New York until Starbucks began to proliferate sometime in the 1994-95 era. It was not done in 1990. You did not walk into your neighborhood coffee shop and go, I'd like a mocha latte frappuccino with 3 pumps. It didn't exist. That was not a thing. But in a world of LA Story, a film that is now 34 years old, each person has a very precise coffee order. Do you have any decaffeinated coffee ice cream? I'll have a double decaf. I'll have a decaf espresso. Do you have any decaffeinated coffee ice cream? And in Steve Martin's incredible line, I'll have a half double decaffeinated half calf with a twist of lemon. It was a big laugh at the time, but he ended up not being that far off. Because I've been in Starbucks and people maybe didn't order a half double decaffeinated half calf with a twist of lemon. But you have these unbelievably convoluted coffee orders, whether it's mochaccino, frappuccino, or whether it's just a regular drip coffee with 18 modifications, including whipped cream. 2 pumps instead of 3, whatever the case might be. He was so right. It's almost frightening. He knew that day was just around the corner, that everybody was going to have their own coffee order. And as early as You've Got Mail, 1998, with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, Dabney Coleman, among others, there is that scene where Hanks talks about the personalized, hyper-personalized coffee orders. But by that time, it had already happened. Everybody knew it. Steve Martin knew what was coming. He put it in that movie. And he ended up being as right as rain. So yeah, LA Story, 34 years old today. Unfortunately, it's not free on any streaming service. You have to pay. Like I always tell you this, I don't like spending other people's money, even if it's only a couple of bucks. But it's available on Apple Plus for $2 or $3, and the same with Amazon Prime. As long as you go into this movie knowing it's not going to be a straightforward Steve Martin comedy a la Three Amigos, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, even Roxanne, which despite the literary leanings is a pretty straightforward comedy. It is surrealist, it's absurdist, but there are a number of enormous laughs and some really keen observations about society as it was then in Los Angeles. But a lot of things that, looking back on it, man, Steve was like a prophet. He was more than just a comic and a funny guy in films. He really had a deep understanding of where society was and where society was going. L.A. Story, released on this day, 1991, directed by Mick Jackson and starring Steve Martin, Victoria Tennant, Sarah Jessica Parker, and the memory wizard herself, Marilu Henner. This has been episode 442 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your late Saturday afternoon with me here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.